Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and it's time for another Breakfast with Blaha, and today I'm having fat-free Greek yogurt, frozen cherries, and almond butter. Alright, let's talk a little bit about nutrition. This is going to be a little more nuanced topic, but something that came up the other day. I had made a video a little while back saying that, look, it turns out when we look at it closely that when certain minimums are met, carbohydrate and fat become largely interchangeable. Right? Protein's a totally different animal. Carbohydrates and fat become largely interchangeable for our purposes for body composition, gaining muscle, losing body fat, training, everything else. That it comes down to really personal preferences and what you're trying to do with your diet at that point. And someone came in and they said, Jason, but didn't you say, I'll get over to whenever, didn't you say before? Didn't you say a number of times that higher carbohydrate, lower fat's probably better for muscle growth? And I always point out that's hypothetical. Well, here's the problem with that statement. It's not necessarily true. In fact, we can make the argument that in some cases you can get higher inflammation, you can get lower insulin sensitivity in some cases, because here's where this matters. Because in this case, people are only looking at the macros themselves rather than the quality of those nutrients. Not all fats are created equal. Not all carbohydrates are created equal. Not all protein are created equal. There are different qualities and effects on the body from these things. That's why when some people try to pretend that it's only macros that matter, well, in the long term, that's not true. Not even remotely true. And the other thing is, when we're discussing science, people will say, Jason, you flip-flop. Well, that's because you guys are used to dealing with people who don't care what science and evidence says. Most of the influencers that you follow will take data from 15 years ago, 10 years ago, and they'll say this is the way it is. Even if stuff comes out and completely debunks it, they don't change their stance because they're afraid of being accused of flip-flopping. I don't do that. As I learn more and I learn new things, I update the information on my channel. Just like with training, the longer I coach, the more I learn, the better I get. And I found for me that when you're working with 20 or more clients full-time in different walks of life, different types of athletes, that my views on certain things in training change, because every 6 months I probably double in knowledge. So if you go back 2 years ago, that means, yes, I probably know 10 times as much right now about training as I did 2 years ago. Therefore, a lot of my data back then is laughable in comparison. And that's just the way it is. I wouldn't listen to the old stuff. Right? We learn over time. So let's come over to the nutrition. It turns out it's more nuanced than that. And this is why it's largely interchangeable. There are merits to both approaches. And again, I want people to understand I am not advocating a low carbohydrate diet here. Okay, that's the difference. And I'm not advocating a high saturated fat diet. These both have issues, major issues. What I'm saying is let's go over and let's look at what the perks were of higher carbohydrate. And again, pointing out that we would often say, well, the hard gainer can't do that because with really high carbohydrate, they can't eat enough, right? So they need the higher fat diets. But what is it we're looking for in carbohydrate? We're looking for training fuel, and we're looking for it being insulinogenic. Okay. And that's why we still need carbohydrate, by the way. We need it in our diet to gain muscle and performance. It is a requirement. And we have minimum amounts. And for most people, that might only be 100 grams a day. For another really serious athlete, it might be 150 grams a day. Now, people will say, but I eat 500 and I'm a high output athlete, and that's fine. But you could replace most of that with fat, and you would probably see no difference. And that's the point. Or you might see certain positive differences. So this is what we're looking for. But let's look at the insulin sensitivity end of it. Look at the insulin specifically. Because if we're eating a high protein diet, and we are, right? We're all shooting for that 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. Protein has a large insulinogenic response. Okay, you're going to get a lot of what we're looking for from the protein. And in many cases, if we're eating, let's take it to the extreme. Let's say you're eating 200 grams of protein every day and only 100 grams of carbohydrate. You're getting a larger insulinogenic response from your protein than your carbohydrate through the day. So then we should be saying, well, what's going to give me the best insulin sensitivity? A really higher carbohydrate diet can impact insulin sensitivity negatively, especially if we're doing stuff like a lot of white rice and things like that, which is, what I did on vertical diet. And I gained muscle and strength amazingly well. I was really happy with that. I wasn't always happy with some of the inflammation I was getting, though. We come back over to, white rice and a fair amount of saturated fat. And other things going on in the body there than just, hey, let's get training fuel. But we start looking at insulin sensitivity. Okay. Well, if you keep carbohydrates in just the range that you need to fuel your training, and again, I want to reiterate, you will need them to fuel your training, but it's not as much as we think. Realistically speaking, how many of us are really burning through more than 100 grams of carbohydrate in a day training? Even me, I drag a sled, and I do pretty high volumes of lifting, and I drag a sled every day almost, most days. All right. And keep in mind, a lot of the protein that we eat is going to get converted into carbohydrate no matter what. When we're eating the quantities of protein that we need for optimal muscle growth, and there's a whole host of reasons of why we're only using a tiny drop of that for muscle growth, but we see larger amounts of muscle gain when we go up to that threshold, a lot of that is getting converted to carbohydrate also. If we're getting our training fuel, anything beyond that is just a preference. That's it, it's a preference. But if we start looking at insulin sensitivity in the muscle tissue specifically, this has its own anabolic thing. So the question becomes, should we be looking for higher circulating insulin from our foods, or should we be looking at maximizing insulin sensitivity itself? And in that case, eating a more moderate carbohydrate intake and being pickier with which carbs we eat matters, right? It matters. Then we come over and say, well, what about the fat side? Well, saturated fat in significant amounts reduces insulin sensitivity. It can contribute to insulin resistance. We know this. The other types improve it. Polyunsaturated fats, and I'm talking all types, even the ones that people think are bad, are generally not. All right, your concern would be too much arachidonic acid. But polyunsaturated fats, all types, including omega-6, have been consistently shown in studies to significantly improve insulin sensitivity. Monounsaturated fats to a much lesser extent, but they still improve it. So from that context, if we are replacing some of the dietary carbohydrate with polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fats and keeping the saturated fat low, obviously you don't have to have it at zero. There's no benefits to zero. But by that same token, people say, well, we don't need saturated fat for anything. We don't need it. Our body produces that easily. That's the one that our body can make unlimited amounts of. We can make that from carbohydrate if we have to. We generally don't. But we could. We can turn other forms of fat into it also. We don't need it. It tastes good. And in moderate amounts, there's no negatives. But if we keep that limited and we were to fill that same window of food with largely polyunsaturated fats and monounsaturated fats, we're not losing anything on the anabolic side. because any loss of circulating insulin that might have a minor response for gaining muscle, it won't matter because our insulin sensitivity itself is higher. So we use the amount that we produce more efficiently. So I'm not saying, by the way, that one of these is automatically better than the other. What I'm saying is that the statement itself is way more nuanced and complex than I had originally displayed discussing this. And it's just something to think about. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.